we read in last week's parsha of Eschanan, the Aseres Adibros and Aseres Advarim, right, mentioned in two different ways. So they come up in Eschanan, but they also come up earlier in Yisro. And the question is, I think that a lot of us maybe even assume, is that the Luchos Rishonos and the Luchos Shenios, were they the same? I feel like a lot of us sort of assume that the Luchos Rishonos were what's in Yisro, and the Luchos Shenios were what's in V'eschanan. So maybe just to sort of get things started, let me just jump to, so I have on this source sheet from both what's in Yisro and then what's in V'eschanan. So let's just take a quick look at that, just so we're all on sort of the same page with regards to the differences, because by and large they are the same, but there are these minute differences, and sometimes not so minute. So the first couple of dibros are pretty much the same, but one of the most common ones that we all, I think, are aware of is, instead of Zachar es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsho in Yisro, in V'eschanan it says Shomer es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsho. But even if we go on further within that same Dibra of Shabbos, in Shemos, in Yisro, it refers back to Breshis. This is Kishesha Semim Asas Hashem Es Hashemayim V'Sa'aretz, as Hashem Es Cheshabam. And down in V'eschanan, it says V'zacharta ki evet hayisa be'eretz Mitzrayim Yosiyach Hashem Elokecha Misham B'yad Chazakav Yizron Netuyah. So it's going back to Yitzias Mitzrayim. Instead, in V'eschanan, we also have under Kabir Esavicha V'esimecha, it says not only Laman Ya'arichun Yamecha, which it says in Yisro, but it also says Ulaman Yitav Lach, and the Gemara talks about that, those extra three words that are there. And another difference is at the last couple of Dibros, Lo Sachmud Esrayecha, here it says Eish Esrayecha, and V'eschanan it says Vilo instead of Lo. But then in Yisro, it repeats Los Achmod Beis Rayecha. Here it says V'los Yisaveh. So clearly some differences. And there's a lot of talk about what the differences are. Is this really just Moshe Rabbeinu giving, sort of teaching and giving his understanding over to Bnei Israel? Is that what the differences are? A lot of discussion around that. But when we ask the question, what was on the Luchos themselves, just to jump back up. So in Parshas Kisisa, right after Moshe Rabbeinu breaks the first Luchos, the pasuk says, "Vayomer Hashem Moshe, Pesal lecha shni luchos avim karishonim." You have to make a new set of Luchos, karishonim, like the first ones. V'chasavti ala Luchos esad davrim asher hayu ala Luchos harishim asher shibarta. And it sounds like, at least pashtus from this pasuk, that the second Luchos should be the mirror image of the first Luchos. So that's sort of the jumping off point. Now, there's a lot of discussion on this. We're only going to see the Haimek Dover, and he quotes the Ibn Ezra, but there's certainly a lot more discussion on this subject than just what we're going to look at today.
Yeah, I don't think you mean mirror image, because mirror image means, the opposite.
The opposite. You're right.
You mean
that's true. That wasn't a good phrase to use. Right. It seems like it should be the same words, right? That's what this pasuk seems to say, is that Hashem is telling Moshe, make them the same way.
I once heard, though, that the first Luchot clearly were written by Hashem, but the second ones, Moshe did the writing.
Right, and that's what it says, B'sal lecha, right? And Rashi talks about this as well. But exactly, Hashem says to Moshe, you have to write or create the second set of Luchos. But it seems like he's supposed to be writing what was on the first set. So let's take a look at the Haimek Dover. So this is on. Sorry, I was going to say that's not the right spot. Right, so this is on in Kisisa, where it says Vayomer Hashem, same pasuk, Moshe Pesal lecha shni luchos avanim karishonim, and the Haimek Dover starts. Just find the right
Probably
spot.
the next page. Yeah, on the bottom of 3.
Yeah, I was going to say. Oh, sorry. This is yeah. Yep. Okay. Haluchos Devarim. So he says Kvar Nidrash al Devarim Hadvarim Esa Devarim. So there's also a drash on when it says Haluchos Esa Devarim. Is there what's the S coming to add in? I feel the Ma Shetamud Vosik Asi Lechadesh. Everything that even in the future there'll be somebody will be Mechadesh. But that's but then he gets into this Bir Ha'inyan. Yesh Lahakdim Masha Kosev Raval, the Ibn Ezra, B'Shem Gaon Zal. So we're not going to look at the Ibn Ezra, but he does quote it pretty much verbatim, and he says, "Luchos Shenios mechubadim min harishonim." So the Ibn Ezra quotes B'Shem Gaon. He doesn't say who the Gaon is, but he says that he's quoting from this Gaon, and he says that the Luchos Shenios were mechubadim min harishonim. No, what does that mean exactly? It says Ibn Ezra kasav alzeh ve'ela kedivrei chalom lo ma'alim v'lo maridim. So the Ibn Ezra does not mince words, and he tells us exactly what he thinks of what this Gaon is saying. But the Gaon seems to be saying that what was in the Luchos Shenios was vastly different from what's in the Luchos Rishonos, and it seems mechubadim, more honored, right, heavier, whatever but it seems like there's something more to the Shnios from the Rishonos. So the Netziv says, "Aval divrei Gaon lav divrei reikein." So the Netziv doesn't want to go away. Doesn't he quotes Ibn Ezra, but he says, what the Gaon is saying he's onto something here. Ubechaz is iser she smolo tachas leroshi elo luchos harishonim v'yaminu techavkeni luchos hashneim. V'hachi isa gamkim b'shmos rabba perak mem zayin how de Amar tovli ki anisi leman elamed chukecha letovaso shal shamosha nisan the tovaso shamosha nisan a kuf chaf yom v'chulei. So he quotes the Medrash in Shmos Rabbah. That says Amar Kodesh Baruch Hu nitzarta chayecha she'einata mafsid. Sorry, this is I'm going to just switch over because it's just hard for me to read this. Unfortunately, this is the only copy I could see I could get online without trying to make photocopies of what I have. But let me just catch that up. Okay. Yeah, L'tovasosha Moshe Nisana Kufchof Yom. So Moshe Rabbeinu was up on Har Sinai for 120 days, right? Because there's 3 times when he's up there for 40-day stints, right? The first set is to get the Luchos Rishonos. Then he goes back up after he breaks the Luchos just to daven for Bnei Israel so that we aren't destroyed. And then he goes back up for 40 more days to get the Luchos Shenios. Okay, so Amar Kodesh Baruch Hu nitzarta chayecha she'einata mafsid. You're not going to lose out on this. Beluchos harishonos lo haya ela aseres advoros v'achshav shenitzarta ani nosin lecha midrash halachos v'agados. So the Midrash in Shmos Rabbah, which again seems to be in line with what the Gaon was saying. I'll try to bring this so you can see it as well. But that Midrash seems to be saying that there was a lot more in the Luchos Shenios than what was in the Luchos Rishonos. That's bringing in basically Dor Shabbat Peh. He goes into more in depth than this in a few other places than Netziv does. Moshe Diuke Mikros for Halachos Hayotz Mizeh. In the Luchos Rishonos, there wasn't the ability to be mechadesh, all the different halachos, looking at different cases, etc. Of Allah lechadesh davar halacha ayadei yud gimel midos v'chadoma. But the idea of being able to use the yud gimel midos, right? We're talking about the yud gimel midos and idreshes for him, the medrash from Rabbi Shmuel Omer, right, that we say in the morning, right before Pesukei de Zimra. Those Yud Gimel Midos, those were not provided, is what the Netziv is saying, for the Luchos Rishonos. It's only for the Luchos Shenios. וכדומה הביאוס התלמוד, ולא היה תורה שבעל פה, אלא דברים המקובלים מפי Moshe. It's only what Moshe himself learned from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. ומה שלא היה מקובל, היה מדמה מילסה למילסה. And outside of that, all they could really do is look at it on a case by case, and if they could be madam, if they saw a similar case where you could apply it to, then that's what they would do. But with the Luchos Shenios was also provided this power, this ability for us to use our own svara through the rules, through the Yud Gimel Midos, to be able to apply halacha in many other ways. But to the beginning, let's see where we are at this point. We're over here now.
No, I think you're still before. You're on the top.
It's a different. I'm sorry. It's a different. It's a different printing than what I have.
Right.
But he said, but from the beginning, the only ones who were able to do this was Moshe and his progeny. Arvos Moav, but when we talk about now they're in Eschanan and they're in Arvos Moav, they're about to go into Eretz Yisrael. Hochiach Moshe liYisrael shekablu zeh haderech k'Moshe vor reish Sefer Dvarim. And again, he goes into this more in Sefer Dvarim, but he says this was the time as they're going into Eretz Yisrael. For Moshe, this is what Moshe felt, that this was the time to teach them all of these other tools to be able to be Mechadesh Torah. And he says, why was this? Now, he may have only did it at Arvos Moav, but he says that the Chet Egel, was the reason for all of this. Shenigzar, ubiyam pate ufakarade v'gombe, umishum hachi yigia begzeres meraglim galus upizur ba'artzos. And then connecting it to the Chet Meraglim, that's what's going to cause us to have exiles and to be scattered, right? The diaspora scattered throughout the lands. V'hi siba machreches lepopulish Torah mitzad shnei tamim. And this was the reason that we needed to be able to be mefalpel in Torah for two different reasons. The Nesiv says, Hainu mitzad shmiras ha'uma. One is just that's what kept us together. That's what kept us as a nation. Was the study of Torah. Umitzad shmiras hora b'Yisrael, and in order to keep halacha, k'moshe bi'arna le'el sof parshas bo ubereish sefer dvarim. So two different reasons. One is the very practical, to be able to paskin halacha accurately, but also just to be able to be involved in Torah, which is what kept us. This is why Moshe had to create, using his own hands, the Luchos Shenios. Don't think that it was because they weren't zocha for something that's created by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? After the Chet, we weren't on the same level, so therefore we have to have man-made luchos. That wasn't it at all. Hamischadeshes bekoach luchos alaluhi hishtatfus amo ha'adam b'siyata d'shmaya. He said, no, the idea of it coming from Moshe was that we have to understand that our ability to be mechadish in Torah is a partnership that requires siyata d'shmaya, but it's a partnership. We have our hand in it as well, quite literally. Just like the first were from HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the second from Moshe, that same partnership is what is required for being mechadish in Torah. Vod ayin lahala mikrachav zayin shagam b'ksiva haya hishtatfus Moshe. V'hainu masha amru chazad afilu ma shetalmud vasik asid lechadesh haya beluchos. And what Chazal say that everything that even what will be mechadesh in future generations was included in the luchos. That they included the Luchos Shenios included everything, meaning all of Torah, kol Torah kula. This is what the Gaon was trying to tell us. He says, That's why they were more mechubad than the first ones. Even though certainly the kedusha of the first set was on a loftier level because they were coming from Hashem. And he says that, and because that they came from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, had they not been destroyed, there would have been, I guess, maybe an ease. I'm trying to understand what that means. Is maybe more access and more and access to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, more of an ease for us to be able to, because we still need to be able to paskin halacha, regardless of whether the Chet Ego happened or not. I mean, that certainly caused a change with, and the Chet Meraglim that changed the situation with having Galus. But either way, we'd have to be able to paskin halacha. But it seems to be saying that it would have been different and it would have been perhaps easier for us in the world of the Luchos Rishonos. Aval kasher niskalkalenu v'haninu nitzrechem lihios yigoyim l'shanim charavish Torah. But once we did have these chataim, and that did change us, they had a sort of a corrupting effect on us, then we really needed to be able to be more yegia in Torah, we had to spend more time and more effort in Torah. And that, for that purpose, the Luchos Achronos are actually more appropriate, or I suppose more appropriate in terms of helping us to be able to accomplish that. And he also compares this to the different the Talmud that we have. We have the Yerushalmi, Kedusha Rabba Me'abavli. The Kedusha of the Yerushalmi says is higher than that of the Bavli. Because that one was created from the earlier Amoraim. Ukemaymer Rava Bishnas B'Shabbos stuff Kufla Medalad Anabahadi Dargamina Desabi Lamali Hari Hoda the Kedushas Rishonim Yoser the Chavin Esoemes. Right, the earlier generations had a better ability to be mechavin towards the emes, to kedusha. V'gam ki kedusha's Eretz Yisrael him oil, and also the fact that they're in Eretz Yisrael. Mikol makom hare yadanu de koch Talmud Bavli mechubad mirshami. But we know that the strength of the Bavli is much more so than the Yerushalmi. Most of our Psak Halacha comes from the Bavli, and I think when there's machlokas Bavli and the Yerushalmi, it seems like we tend to focus more on the Bavli. V'afagavde shenikra b'Sanhedrin daf chof dalid de me chashikim hushiveni ze Talmud Bavli. And even though, so the Gemara Sanhedrin says, quotes the pasuk in Eicha, that in the darkness I will be living with those who are, I think it says who are dead, the Olam Ames, something like that. He says that the Gemara in Sanhedrin says that Talmud Bavli, that is the Bavli of being in the darkness. But the Netziv says don't look at that as being a negative. That's not what the Gemara is telling us. Kocha hanifla laha'ir halacha afilu b'mechashikim hainu b'bava v'chutz la'aretz. He says the ability, the incredible, or the wondrous ability for us to be able to bring out halacha in the darkness of chutz la'aretz, of living in the different areas that we've lived in over the generations. Shem ba'or eretz hakodesh v'li koach Talmud Bavli lo higiu la'or hara sham, and it's only because of the koach of the Talmud Bavli that we were able to reach the abilities in the Torah that we have produced over the centuries outside of Eretz Yisrael. Ume'ein zeh bebechina aliyona haya hevda ben luchos rishonos la'achronos. And he said this is really the difference between the Luchos Rishonos and Achronos as well. It is Venira Shehu HaKavana b'Maimarim Menachos Daf Tzadites Matzir Shebitula Shal Torah Zeu Yesoda Dichziv Asher Shibarta Amar Lo Kadosh Baruch Hu LaMoshe Yasher Kochacha Sheshibarta. Right, the Gemara in Menachos says when HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when Moshe breaks the Luchos, right? So what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu say back to him? He says, Yasher kochacha, right? Yasher koyach, as we say. Interestingly, that in other words, what was he really trying to say is that's what we needed to have in place in order to be able to survive through the Galus. Says Elabitul Haino Shibir Haluchos Zoyasoda, the Mishum Halachini, Nidnu Luchos Shnim Baofen Acher, Shehu Yasoda Tor Lechadish Ba'amel. Bishvazen Nasan HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yashur Koach LaMoshe Sheshavar Luchos Arishonos, V'haya Makav Litin Luchos Shnios Baofen Acher. Says V'ayin B'Sefer Devarim, even further. So that's where he ends off this piece. What's interesting, I think, to me, is that it seems in a way very similar to what we saw 2 weeks ago, right before Tisha B'Av, when we saw with the Mezritcher Maggid. It said also that it's only the koach of Tisha B'Av that then leads to the development of the Talmud Bavli, right? And he says that that's what enables us to survive in Galus, is this incredible amount of, right, the depth and breadth of Torah that was developed only after after Tisha B'Av, meaning after the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, right? That's what the Mezritcher Maggid said. That's what has kept us going. And then it seems to be saying something very similarly, clearly Litvish versus a Hasidic outlook, but clearly a similar vein of that's what sort of kept us, and that was the difference between the Luchos Rishonos and the Luchos Shenios. What's interesting is he's even bringing this all the way back to the Chetor Megaraglim and all the way back to the Luchos, which we didn't see the Mezritcher Maggid talk about, but it seems to be a similar idea of what was necessary, what was needed for us to be able to survive Galus, such a long Galus, and the ability for us to connect only through Torah. As an aside, it makes me think of, when we look at all the communities and, the communities that have not lasted, the communities that have done very well, and certainly it seems to me that the communities that have done so well are the ones who always had had a lot of, institutions of Torah, had institutions of Torah learning in order to be able to keep them growing. And, that's one thing we have here in Chicago. So it seems to be like that's, that sort of rings true.
Is he trying to say that all this additional stuff that Moshe got, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, came during the middle 40 days of those 120?
That's a good question. It seems like, so the middle 40 days, it seems like was just Moshe Rabbeinu davening for us. What was, did he, in those first 40 days, did he get all of Torah Sheba'al Peh? Or did he start to get even more Torah Sheba'al Peh in the latter 40 days? That's an interesting question. I don't know.
The Torah didn't change, so you could argue he got the Torah,
right? The
5 books, the first 40 days. He prayed for the second, and in the third 40 days, he didn't have to go over the Torah. He had an encyclopedic and a photographic memory. He got everything else that ended up.
Perhaps
that's why it was good that he broke them.
So, but even in the first 40, he must have had Torah Sheba'al Peh, because at least, did he get the same breadth and depth of it? I don't know, but he must have had at least, quite a bit of it, because how would you even keep Shabbos without Torah Sheba'al Peh? I mean, how would Shechita, right? We wouldn't know all of those laws without Torah Sheba'al Peh. So there's so much. So I don't know, but maybe all those, like the Yud Gimel Midos, did he get those to be able to darshan out? Maybe that was the latter, 40 days that he got all of those extra tools to be able to paskin. I mean, that seems like what the Netziv is saying, is that all of those additional tools where we are able to look into Torah and understand, like, when electricity, came out so many decades ago, or became much more common in people's homes, right? And all of a sudden, Reb Moshe and all the other rabbis had to figure out, what does this mean? And the Chazon Ish, and what can we do with the electricity on Shabbos and the Yom Tov? What can't we do? I mean, all those things, all of it comes from in a Torah Shabbat Pem, be able to apply that. So all of those mitos, maybe that was the latter 40 days that,
Okay.
maybe that's what the Netziv is telling us.
Now, to come back to what you started with, there's the one major difference that is unexplained is why in the original ones does it say Kishesh Yishmiyim Asa Hashem Es Hashemayim V'Esaretz? That makes sense for Shabbos.
Right.
Remember Shabbos because God took you out of Egypt? That makes no sense. There's no reason.
Right.
That doesn't follow.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Netziv doesn't go into that here. I haven't seen what the Netziv says in Veschanan on that, but others like the Rabbeinu Bechai and others will say that the connection is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought us out of the slavery of Egypt, right, in order for us to receive the Torah. And one of the sort of quintessential pieces of Torah is that we keep Shabbos. So that's sort of the idea, is that Shabbos and Kashrus always seem to be like some of the central themes of what really makes us Jews. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's there's some interesting ideas of how it connects, because you're right, it seems to connect much more towards Ma'aseh Bereishis than it does towards Yetzias Mitzrayim. So yeah, maybe we'll try and do a follow-up on that and look into that a little bit more deeply. But
all the differences you could explain, they go a little further, but that's a major difference between the two.
Yep.
And in the second, in Veschanan, it doesn't even mention Brias Olam.
Right. Absolutely, it is. And interestingly enough, that's not one of the differences that seems to be talked about by Chazal. Chazal seem to be much more focused on Shomer v'Zachor, right? We see the Midrashim that it was said B'dibur Echad. The Lo Sisave is another one that's talked about a lot. So it's an interesting question, like why isn't it? Because it's certainly on the surface of it, that seems to be a pretty big difference.